Welcome to the RSP Film Theory. Adam Harstad, Matt Waldman. Adam, it's great to see you.
It is great to be seen.
Yeah, and good because it's been funny. We've had folks ask us about this show and when we were starting up and whether we were going to start up, and they missed seeing your face on here. So, this week we're going to get a chance to talk about some of the off-season storylines or things that of interest to you and to me about the upcoming season and the state of football, and then also we'll kick off to this whole show with segments about maybe bits of wisdom that we think fantasy GMs should try to heed in the early part of the season. Certainly, we did a fantasy roundtable last night with the football guys staff. I asked them about the little voice in their heads and what kind of wisdom they want to listen to heading into week one that they should remind themselves and other people to remember. How about you? What are some of the things that you think about that you would think fantasy GMs should remember, Dynasty or redraft?
My big thing that I always try to remind myself, I very strongly believe that a lot of what happens that we see is random. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of work in preparation, and it's not an accident that Jamar Chase is a phenomenal wide receiver. But if he breaks one particular catch for a very long gain and not another particular catch, that's largely random. And because it's random, I think the sequencing isn't really important. Like, it's not necessarily meaningful, but we humans are natural storytellers. And I always say too, people ask me if I'm an analytics guy, and I say, no, I'm a storyteller at heart. I love numbers because they kind of flesh out the story. But so we naturally see a sequence of things and craft a story around it. If a player has a really strong end of the season, a really strong last 3 weeks, randomness says, like, well, he was going to have 3 good weeks sometime in the year, and it just happened that they all happened to come at the end of the season, and that's randomness. But we see that and we say, oh, he's finally getting it. He's fine. It's all coming together. He's going to carry that over into the new season. And then similarly, especially very early in the year, when we don't have a lot of other data to go on, we see somebody have a great week early in the season, and we say, oh, he's breaking out. It's time. The time has come. And not like guys like Devery Henderson. Devery Henderson was a great wide receiver for the Saints. He was basically just a situational deep threat, a very good situational deep threat. He had a very good role. And occasionally he would just have a huge game because the matchup was there, or because he got one of those lucky catches that he managed to break 80 yards for a touchdown. Devery Henderson would have a random big game. And if that big game comes in week one, people would wonder, is this the Devery Henderson breakout that we've been waiting for? When the reality is that, like, if he's going to have 3 big games in a year, there's a 3 in 18 chance in any given week, 3 in 17 chance that, like, this is the week that it's going to come. So that's what I always try to remind myself, that all new data is good data, but it's important not to get fooled by the sequencing of the data. I don't think the order that things happen in is necessarily nearly as meaningful as my storyteller brain wants to convince me that it is.
I love that you brought up the Ken Burrow of the early 2000s. Devery Henderson right there.
Yeah, I mean, Lance Moore, I mean, Devery Henderson, I mean, Kenny Stills was a great receiver for the Saints.
Does that say something to us about Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, Pat Bryant, Devon
Maybe.
baby, yeah.
One of the things I love about Sean Payton's offense is everybody's looking for, like, they're all trying to copy Belichick. For the longest time, they were trying to copy Belichick, and they want guys who can, like, do everything, right? They want a Troy Brown who's not only a great wide receiver, he can also be like a 6th defensive back if you need. Whereas Sean Payton's offense, it's like, no, we don't want people to do everything. Like, we have very clearly defined roles. Like, this guy is the deep threat, and he's just going to do deep threat stuff, right? And then the running back, he's going to be a receiver out of the backfield. Like most wide receivers are catching at multiple different levels, but in Sean Payton's offense, Alvin Kamara is catching the short stuff. Michael Thomas was catching the medium stuff. Somebody like Kenny Stills or Devery Henderson was catching the long stuff. Everybody was excelling in their clearly defined role. And I think there's a lot of beauty and simplicity. Obviously, it's not the only way to run an offense, but obviously they had a lot of tremendous success with it, and I think there's a lot of beauty and simplicity in that.
Yeah, it's easier to draft guys as well if you realize that you're just letting them play to their strengths and
Right.
on a very on a very the specific end of the spectrum. And also, there's probably some parts of it where you go, well, I don't want the headache of a Michael Thomas, because if Michael Thomas can do a lot more than what I think, even though they put him in a very defined role, I think that worked out very well for him at a high level. But you pick somebody who can do a little bit of everything or do it very well, they're probably a bigger headache to deal with in terms of long-term keeping them. And that becomes a bit of a problem there. But what I think I gained most out of this is that what you're telling me is that the last three good quips you had against Jason Wood pretty much explains to me that it's not necessarily that you have successfully trolled Jason Wood. You're just 3 for 3 recently.
The last three good quips that you know of, that you were on hand to witness. You never know. My relationship with Wood is deep. It's like an onion. There are layers to it.
Well, I am waiting. I am waiting to troll him over his Caleb Williams thoughts on our roundtable this week, because he feels like that Caleb Williams had a very bad preseason, and that Ben Johnson was very frustrated with him, and is now worried that he's invested too much in Caleb Williams this year, where I'm kind of more of the opinion that Caleb Williams can be a work in progress and still conceivably have a top 5 season as a fantasy quarterback, though I would say more realistically it will be the low end of the top 12 for him as probably the aiming point. Jay Cutler was a work in progress and had a Pro Bowl year, his first full year as a starter. And
he was phenomenal that year with Trustman, when it kind of flew under the radar because he did half the year and McCown did half the year. But like if you combined them into one, they were like a top 5 quarterback that year.
Yeah. So I mean, you got that too. So all right.
So for those who missed it, we did our staff draft, and anytime any experienced player, let's say, was getting drafted, I would say, hey, isn't he older than Jason Wood?
Yep.
And finally Wood broke down and said, I'm not the oldest person in the draft here. And I said, no, but you're the oldest person who's insecure enough about his age that this is going to bother him.
Exactly. And then people decided to remind Wood repeatedly about how much you own him in these in these fun little chats that we have. Wood's a good sport about it. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's great that not overreacting, I think is a good thing. I think to me the reaction probably is merited when there's a good player behind a player who gets hurt and it's a clear-cut injury. Then that's a chance where you probably want to go fairly strong to get a player if the situation is clear enough that he is the guy. I think an example of something that people would be concerned about, or you see two ends of the spectrum with, would be if, for instance, Kyron Williams, lost his leg. Let's just say a megalodon emerged from the bowels of the turf and somehow bit off his leg. Think of a completely fictional scenario, and now we have to now we have to look at the fact that we're looking at either Blake Corum or Jarquez Hunter. That's a much cloudier situation where some people are going to go all in on one or the other and probably waste some fab. But if you were looking at Seattle and Kenneth Walker were to go down and be out for the year, it's probably a much clearer cut instance to look at not Damian Martinez, it's funny, Zach Charbonnet, and be able to say that's probably worth going super strong early on. Would you agree with that kind of just like basic assessment?
Yeah, I mean, we know what we know, and as we get new information, it's pretty easy to pivot. And there's a lot of value in warning against overreacting. We talk about, like, for the first 4 weeks of the season, ADP is still more predictive than early season results. But for me, it's even beyond the overreacting. It's just remembering that a lot of stuff that happens is a random walk. Like if a guy is good in the first week and then bad in the second week, it's easy to say, oh, the backup is passing him. If a guy's bad in the first week and good in the second week, it's easy to say, oh, he's finally taking over the role. But the reality is that guys have good weeks and guys have bad weeks. It doesn't mean necessarily anything, unless it does, of course.
Yeah, James Conner and Benny Snell was a classic example I bring up a lot. After, I think, week 1 on a Monday night game, people were concluding that James Conner was has been after his 3rd or 4th year in the league, and Benny Snell was the new thing in Pittsburgh, and we've seen how that's played out.
Or fumbles is a big one too. You know, like every time a rookie fumbles, people are like, "Oh, he's about to lose his job." But the reality is, everybody fumbles. Yeah. You know, even players who are famous for their ball security will, on occasion, fumble. And sometimes those fumbles are going to come in week 1. It doesn't necessarily mean anything that it comes in week 1 and not in week 5.
Right. You know, you'd have to fill in the blanks with that more. Are they fumbling way throughout camp, and they've had a ball security issue in college, in addition to fumbling more throughout camp, and it's been talked about by the coaches? Does the coach have a history of being a stickler for it? Maybe those are extreme examples of where you'd have to worry about that. But most of the time, you're right. I mean, and then you could look at examples of, is the player an ungodly talent like Adrian Peterson, who fumbled, I want to say, in the double digits his first year as a rookie, and they would just take him out for like a series or two just to kind of get him to calm down a little bit, and then they'd stick him right back in. So if Ashton Jeanty fumbles this year, I wouldn't worry about it so much. You know, if Bayshul Tootin in a 3-man competition fumbles a fair bit early on, that might be a little bit more concerning. But don't react to one fumble. Yeah.
Doug Drennan had an article probably 20 years back at this point, that says, like, if you never fumble, you're not fumbling enough. Where basically, like, if you told Adrian Peterson that his family had been taken hostage, and if he fumbled the ball a single time the entire game, his family would be killed, Adrian Peterson would go the entire game without fumbling. He'd take every handoff, he'd wrap it up with 2 hands, and he'd take a knee, and he'd go down.
That's what Tyson Williams did in the second half of his starting debut and ruined his career.
Right. It's trivially easy to not fumble. You know, all you got to do is secure the handoff and go down, you know, like wrap it up. You know, if you get a little bit more aggressive, maybe your chances of fumbling go from like 0.1% up to like 0.5%, but now you're gaining like 2 or 3 yards per carry. And the more you push, the more likely you are to fumble. You know, if you're trying to fight through contact, well, okay, maybe something bad is going to happen to the ball while you're fighting. But also sometimes when you fight through contact, you're going to gain those extra yards. And there's like an equilibrium point where it's just the right amount of aggressiveness, where the extra benefits you're gaining offset the extra risk of fumbles. And if you go past that, then you need to dial it back. But the optimal fumble rate is never 0.
Yeah. No, I mean, though I do love the idea that we need to like we need to find a kid who we can pay like $50 to go to a class and, of Doug Drennan's, who's a student of Doug's and his math courses, and say, you know, and get like a D on the test and come back and say, I'd like a retake, because, you know, I mean, if you don't fumble, you're just not fumbling enough. And
I was a little worried there. I thought you were about to say we should try kidnapping a player's family, but no. Okay, I just had to make sure.
No. I mean, I know I've got some out there ideas, but we're not criminal around here. Okay,
rarely criminal.
Yeah, rarely criminal. We're misdemeanors. We're much more misdemeanors than felonies. We'll just put it that way. All right, so cool. I mean, in terms of trading, where do you stand? Review with us again. Where are you on trading at this point of the year? Where, you know, in redraft and Dynasty, would you prefer to wait a little bit and see what you've got and make deals, or are you but from what I remember, you're more of a philosophy of, listen, I trade my way in and out of things pretty much throughout the season, so I don't really have a stance on timing when it comes to when I should make deals.
Yeah, in redraft, I'm a bit of a cynic. The time to trade in redraft it's probably not going to happen. Problem in redraft is everybody's competing for the same thing. Everybody wants the highest score in week 17. And so people are valuing the same thing. Dynasty, it's much easier where like some people are not trying to get the highest score in week 17. Some people are looking towards the future. Some people are just trying to make the playoffs. There's a lot more variance in terms of what people need, what people value. You get a lot more unbalanced rosters. You know, everybody comes out of a redraft with their pretty roster with like 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 4 wide receivers, 2 tight ends. And they're like, great, I've got my starting lineup and 1 backup at each position. I'm set. Whereas in Dynasty, it's very easy to find yourself in a situation where you're like, I have 4 quarterbacks, 1 running back, 8 wide receivers, and no tight ends. And then all of a sudden, yeah, I'm kind of open to a trade at that point. So redraft trades are, I mean, like I've heard rumors that they exist, but it's been a long time since I've seen one in the wild. It's kind of like the American buffalo. They're endangered. Maybe they're making their way back, but they are not nearly as numerous as they are in the popular imagination. Dynasty trades, I'm a big believer in, you know, have your values. And if I'm getting more than what I think a guy's worth, I'm going to do it. If I'm selling a guy for more than I think he's worth, I'm going to do it. That's true after week 1, before week 1, after whenever. And I find that being open to saying like, these are my values and I'm going to stick to them creates a lot of opportunities, because a lot of people are a little nervous to trade after week 1 because they're like, is this a mirage? Is this real? And people are worried about losing trades. And it's like fumbling. If you never lose a trade, you're not trading enough. You know, if you've got 100% success rate on trades, question is, why aren't you trading more?
Yeah.
There's probably like a 90-10 trade out there. You could take that. That's going to lower your success rate, but still it's a 90-10 trade. It's pure profit. So yeah, I've made some truly atrocious trades in my time. And I keep lists of them to remind myself that like, this might be another truly atrocious trade. I've made some real doozies. But it was fine.
Can it top Byron Leftwich or Michael Vick for Byron Leftwich?
Oh, yeah.
It could top that? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I traded A.J. Green and Demaryius Thomas for Maurice Jones-Drew. And he had like 1 more season. Oh. And then that was like right at the start for A.J. Green and Demaryius Thomas. And what are some other good ones? I traded... oh man, I'd have to go back and look at my list. It's been a long time since I reviewed it.
That was a good one. We put enough stink on the show here that people need a deodorizer for that. So, but you know,
Devontae Adams for Dion Lewis. That was, and I was very proud of that one. And that's one where still I'm like, process was sound, and also it was kind of a backdoor cover, because like 3 years later, long after it was clear I'd lost that trade, I wound up in the championship game, and Dion Lewis had some random out of nowhere big game, and I won, and I wouldn't have otherwise won. And so now I just say I traded Devontae Adams for a championship, which was worth it.
Nice recovery. I like that. So, so this offseason, you know, were there any rules changes or developments within the structure of the league, or anything with, you know, personnel changes or personnel developments with players that are storylines that you found particularly interesting for whatever reason, whether it's, you know, because you're rooting for the players, whether you think it has fantasy implications, whether it says something about how people look at situations and react to information or partial information? What's been fascinating for you to follow?
I am very, very interested to see Pete Carroll's return to the NFL, and see kind of how that goes. I kind of love retread coaches. I'm excited to see Mike Vrabel back. I'm excited to see another year of Jim Harbaugh and Sean Payton. I kind of feel like, you know, everybody's always chasing the next wonderkind. Everybody wants the next Kyle Shanahan. And I'm guilty of it too. I loved and continue to love Mike McDaniel in Miami. And when the Broncos missed out on McDaniel, I was like desolate about that. Peyton's not as sexy of a name, but I kind of feel like hiring proven successful head coaches, once a little bit of the shine's off their name, is like the biggest hack in the NFL. And it's even the ones where I was skeptical. Like I was saying this a couple years ago, and people are like, well, are you sure that, I'm like, well, yeah, the Broncos traded for Peyton. It was probably a good move. And they're like, are you sure that's going to work out? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure. I think in expectation, it's a good move. But even by the end of the season, people are like, wow, the Broncos are all of a sudden really feisty. And it kind of gets to, we talk a lot about I think the single most important thing for team success is also the single hardest thing to measure, and that's culture. And guys who have a proven history of building culture, I think that translates a lot better. Eventually the X's and O's catch up to you. I don't think Peyton, I'm sure he's a brilliant, I'm sure he's a brilliant offensive mind. But I don't think he is 2 steps ahead of the league like he was in 2006, 2007. But he's proven repeatedly that he can build and maintain a culture, and that's just so important to long-term success. So I'm really excited to see a new crop of retreads coming in.
Let's talk about that for a minute. Just
okay.
Expand on that, because I love the thoughts about him, and I'm a fan of those guys too that you mentioned. And I think one of the points you brought up is that it's not that they're 2 steps ahead of the league any longer. I don't think they are allowed to try and be 2 steps ahead of the league on as regular of a basis as a head coach. And the reason being is that they become famous for something that the owners usually want. And then the owners say, you're known for this. We want you to do that. And 2, if you try to push the envelope too much, you can fail dramatically in the league by trying to do something that's a little bit too out there. So you get constrained a little bit more the more your experience is. And then you start to realize too that the players you have and how you and the culture that you develop is more important oftentimes than whether your scheme is cutting edge. You want to have schematic advantages here and there, but it comes down to a certain number of plays per game. And I think that you find that, I think Mike McDaniel's found that out a little bit. And, this is probably too dramatic of an example and it may not be as clear, but I look at Skylar Thompson in Pittsburgh, and it was preseason, and he was probably playing against third teamers, and he had a good preseason. But when he was asked about his preseason, he said, I've learned a lot from being around Aaron Rodgers, and I learned also over the years, after my experiences in the pros, to just be me and play my game and go down swinging the way that I play. And maybe I'm reading in too much to that, but from watching the film in Miami, in the preseason, he was allowed to be who he was. When they asked him to play in the regular season, Miami was in a playoff push, had winning records, and Tua Tagovailoa was only going to be gone for a short to, maybe intermediate amount of time. And they wanted a quarterback that wasn't going to make mistakes. And a rookie's going to make mistakes, but he was their next guy on the bench. I felt like Mike McDaniel really put the governor on Skylar Thompson based on studying him at Kansas State. He was a much more aggressive player, much more willing to go downfield, much more willing to buy time. And the way that he reacted to things, it seemed like, and the way that the plays that were called, the plays seemed to be more focused on just allowing them to be in situations to run the ball and get off the field if they had to. Like, I felt like they played it super safe with him. And when they didn't, he connected. Sometimes his receivers just didn't catch the ball. But they weren't really allowing him to be who he was. And I think he learned a lesson from that. And I think for me, I look at that and I say, I wonder if Mike McDaniel has kind of realized that if you don't have a wealth of personnel, even if your personnel isn't what you want it to be to run your system, you still have to have a system that's flexible enough and good enough to threaten teams and to do a little bit more. I mean, I kind of feel like that he got a little more enamored with, he realized it's a little more than just your system, in a variety of ways, whether it's personnel or whether it's how you how you tailor that to your personnel, and also about dealing with adversity. And I think Liam Cohen is a good example of a young coach who is getting love for being an offensive mind because of being in Sean Payton's system, being in Tampa, and having an excellent set of skill weapons to execute his scheme, and that he's a good mind. But I've heard from people who've known him say he's got the makings to be a good leader. He understands offensive football and he does a good job with it. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Jacksonville, where a lot of the decision makers in those rooms above him are young and some would characterize as immature and lacking perspective. And could we see a scenario where Liam Cohen starts hot, and then the realities of being a delegator, a leader, a PR figurehead, the person everyone comes to with problems, a person that everyone goes around to backdoor them when he doesn't accede to their wishes. How's he going to handle all that? How's that going to impact his game? And so, to your point, when you're a retread, you've already learned those tough lessons, and that makes you one step wiser about how to be a manager of the game. And we see this in corporate America. We see it in football. We hire people who are skilled in one area, but very rarely do they have the ability to manage, and they have to make mistakes through it in a very public way and get oftentimes, excoriated, I guess, to excoriated to and hopefully survive enough of that excoriation to reach the other side and learn from it and still have a job. And a lot of them don't. And I think GMs need to have more. We need to have more retread GMs, if you ask me, for that very same reason, because very rarely does a GM get a second chance if they screw it up.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, you were saying that oftentimes you feel like a retread isn't allowed to do something different than what they're known for. To me, it seems plausible. If you hire Sean Payton, you're really hiring the Sean Payton system. I wonder how much of it, though, is that a lot of coaches who were successful in their first stop, they were successful because they had a brilliant, groundbreaking idea. And it's just hard to have two brilliant, groundbreaking ideas. The West Coast offense was revolutionary. Most people don't have two ideas like that in their lifetime. And there are examples. You look at Belichick, completely retooled his offense between 2006 and 2007. He was very old school, smash mouth, run, play action. And he spent a lot of time with Urban Meyer, and he kind of imported the college spread to tremendous effect. And then retooled it once again in 2010 when he drafted Gronkowski and Hernandez and started funneling it more through his tight ends. And then I would say even retooled it once again around 2015, 2016, 2017, where he was still running it through Gronkowski, but now he's running Gronkowski deep down the field. Gronkowski led the NFL in yards per reception over a 3 or 4 year span. And Belichick saw that this deep middle is now open to these larger receivers because everybody's doing their little speedsters in that area. And there's a bunch of mismatches to be had there. And obviously Bill Belichick is sui generis. There's one Bill Belichick. But I wonder sometimes if it's just if it's that you're not allowed to experiment, or if it's just that it's hard to have groundbreaking ideas all the time. Most people get zero. Some people are lucky enough to have one. And for those people, it just stick with the one idea that you had if it's still working.
Yeah, it's probably a combination of both weighted towards the first point that you made, that it's hard to find more than one. But I would say the environment makes it difficult to have more than one as a reinforcement of that of that unlikely occurrence in the first place.
And I think expectations can vary so much from franchise to franchise and organization to organization. I think if Mike Tomlin went to the Rooneys and said, "Hey, I want to completely remake our identity," I feel like the Rooneys would be like, "Well, okay, we're nervous about this, but if you've got a well thought out plan and you want to go with it, like we're going to give you the leeway." Because the Rooneys are very much like, we're going to facilitate, like anything that the franchise needs we'll be there for, but we're not running the team. You guys are running the team. We are the producers in the movie. You are the director. Our job is to make your vision a reality. Whereas I think you're getting a lot of teams, especially as the value of franchises has skyrocketed, where you're getting a lot more Dan Snyder situations where it's not, Dan Snyder wasn't there to facilitate.
Yeah, they're Hollywood. They're Hollywood producers as opposed to independent film producers.
Right. It's he wants to be Steven Spielberg. He wants to be the first name on the marquee. He wants it. The teams have become.
He wants to screw up Dexter.
Right. He wants to be the reason the team succeeds or fails. In his mind, he wants to be the reason it succeeds. But at the end of the day, he's going to be the reason it does whatever. And so a lot of more teams have become billionaire playthings. And you always talk about Sean McVay wanted Jared Goff to just be like this puppet on strings that's executing his vision. I feel like a lot of new school team owners want to be Sean McVay, and they want the head coach to be their Jared Goff, where like, oh, my vision is we're going to bring in Sean Payton and run the Sean Payton offense and have success like New Orleans did. And they want, I don't know. I don't really know.
Yeah, but ownership. I kind of want to own the LA Rams now and like be the guy who like gets to put strings on Sean McVay, because he makes some fun faces on draft day. Yep. We could light up his eyes and do all sorts of things with that. That could be fun. But no, I mean, that makes sense. It is going to be fascinating to see that. I'm trying to think of what situation. Speaking of the Steelers, I can't give up on the idea that we've given up on Aaron Rodgers too soon. And that may just me desiring to see the old man do it one more time, and also just being kind of tired of people focus on what he says about things outside of football, and his exposure on social media and on football media platforms. I just know that I just look at this organization and I kind of feel like that this could be a sneaky team in the NFC North, in the AFC North. And I mean, the defense is good enough, and I think that if the offensive line can play reasonably well, Aaron Rodgers' ability to play chess pre-snap, I think he has. The big question is, does he have enough weapons to be receptive to that? Garrett Wilson, as Brandon Angela and I were talking about last night, Garrett Wilson was frustrated a fair bit because of the fact that Aaron Rodgers demanded more of him conceptually than what Garrett Wilson had experience doing. And it wasn't like that he had a poor season, but he's not a 1,500-yard receiver with Aaron Rodgers. And then they put Devontae Adams in there, and he still has a pretty strong season. Can the combination of DK Metcalf and Calvin Austin do that? Is DK Metcalf conceptually advanced enough to do that? I think the only one who is probably Pat Freiermuth, like as a sure bet. But if one of those other guys shows that he's more than what we've seen from them, this offense could be sneaky good. I think that's why obviously Jaylen Warren has been put in as the starter right now, is because he can block, that he can make adjustments out of the backfield, and I think Aaron Rodgers trusts him enough to do the things that Rodgers will do at the line of scrimmage to say, "Yeah, Arthur, I know it's your offense, but this is my foot. This is your scheme, but this is my offense."
He's more of a Joseph Adai than a Donald Brown.
Yeah, exactly.
That reminds me of Demaryius Thomas. When Peyton Manning got to Denver, Thomas said that like it was extremely hard because he'd never had a quarterback that was like that demanding of him, where he'd run a route and he'd get separation and he's open, and Peyton would come and chew him off because he's a yard deeper than Peyton wanted him to be. And Peyton's like, I want you to be at this point at this time every time, 100% of the time. And if you can do that, you're going to have a phenomenal season. And Demaryius bought in hard, and he worked hard, and he gave Peyton that level of precision that Peyton was demanding, and then had several monster seasons. And that also carried over, like, even once Peyton was gone. Like, I don't think it's that surprising that a lot of Peyton Manning's former wide receivers seem to punch above their weight class. You know, you look at like Eric Decker with the Jets or Pierre Garçon with Washington, where like even when they're in new environments, they bring that rigor. And Demaryius has said that he kind of credits Peyton Manning with teaching him how to be a top level wide receiver. But it's one of those things where you just don't know. I mean, where there's it's like Chad Johnson was a phenomenal receiver, Chad Ochocinco, went to New England, and all of a sudden he's in this very demanding scheme that wants him to do things a certain way. And at that point, I feel like it's Donald Glover in Lethal Weapon, where he's like, I'm getting too old for this shit. Like, yeah. I'm going to do things the way I know how to do them. And you just don't know who's going to stick and who's not.
I mean, Thomas didn't stick there. Brandon Lloyd didn't stick there. Marvin, who was it? Reggie Wayne didn't stick there. So yeah, I mean, it's a different way, and it's a wholly different system too, because they playing in a West Coast oriented system, and then playing in Earhart Perkins probably had some big adjustments in that frame as well. But to Peyton's credit, the other thing about Peyton that was fascinating that I heard about that story was also that Peyton also would say to him, where do you like the ball out of your break? Where do you want me to put the ball? And like that kind of detail too.
Right. Like he's demanding, but he's also giving. Like, he's like, if you give me this level of precision, I will give you an equal level of precision, where it's, you know, like a relationship has to be mutual. Yeah. You can't just ask. And that was kind of the cool thing about Peyton is he and really, I feel all the greats, you know, I think there are, not to stereotype, but I kind of feel like that's the difference between like a Jay Cutler and a Peyton Manning is I don't think Jay Cutler is going to go out of his way. It doesn't seem, he never gives me the impression that he's the kind of guy who's going to go out of his way for his guys the same way he wants them to go out of their way for him.
There you go. You know, I definitely know that from what we've seen on the field, you know, Derek Carr is probably a good classification of that type of player. Based on where he's placed hospital balls. You know, it's either that or the skill just level isn't just that high enough. Which is probably, maybe that's the difference between Peyton Manning, Jay Cutler below that, and Derek Carr below that.
Getting back to the opening bit about how like sequencing is often a mirage, like the order doesn't really matter. So you look at old quarterbacks, and pretty universally, they were pretty terrible in their last season. You know, they have a bad year and then they retire. That's usually the end. But if you ignore the very last season, you see that old quarterbacks, it's very common for them to have a bad year and then come back for another year after that and rebound and have a good year. You know, Phillip Rivers he was looking like he was pretty toast in San Diego around like 2012, 2013. And then he turned it around and had like 4, 5, 6 more good seasons after that. Kurt Warner, for a while in New York, you know, he was looking like he'd taken a few too many hits in that Mike Martz protection scheme. And then he went back to Arizona and he really turned it around. And so kind of the theory is that there's random variation. People have up years and down years. If you're 26 and you have a down year, well, there's no question. You're going to come back for another year, and then just randomly you're going to have a better season. That's just fluctuation. That's regression to the mean. If you're 36 and you have a bad year, maybe you start doing the Donald Glover thing, that I'm getting too old for this shit, and you retire. And it looks like, to somebody who's watching, that like, oh, quarterbacks fall off a cliff and they retire, when really there's a lot more to it than that. And so with Aaron Rodgers, I'm very open to the possibility that like he's hit the cliff, he's done. This is Johnny Unitas trying to hang on with the Chargers. But I'm also open to the possibility that like maybe it was just a down year. He had down years before in Green Bay and then came back and had good years again. I'm not ruling out the possibility at all that that he improves significantly on what we saw last year.
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking that's probably one of the teams I'm most fascinated with watching is the Steelers offense and seeing what he can do with the pieces that are there. I think a lot of those pieces are young enough that they're maybe just like Fryer was just old enough to have a good quarterback in Ben Roethlisberger, and then be dealing with quarterbacks who were, I joked, illegitimate starting bastages that like Mason Rudolph and Justin Fields, and then he got a taste
Mitch
of
Trubisky, the only
Mitchell
quarterback
Trubisky.
so bad he couldn't get
Yeah.
he couldn't get to 500 with Mike Tomlin.
Right, Kenny Pickett,
Doc Hodges.
yeah, exactly. And then then you got a little bit of a taste with Russell Wilson, and while Russell's a little bit of a different bird, you could see that Calvin Johnson took off. Pat Freiermuth had 5 of his 7 touchdowns with Wilson, and the last time he had 7 touchdowns was with Ben Roethlisberger. So I think that there's elements there. And DK Metcalf, I mean, you look at the story with him in the offseason, he tells a story that I thought was fascinating about Seattle, that under Ryan Grubb or I think it was Grubb who was the coordinator for them last year. I don't remember who the coordinator was, but under their coordinator, there was a new coordinator, and Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf had a habit under Pete Carroll that they would send when they would do their film study, they would send off coverages or looks or pre-snap alignments of the secondary and send it off to their offensive coordinator and say, hey, in these situations, this is what I'm noticing, as kind of a supplement to help out the team, and say, if we run this route or these routes, we're going to get wide open in these situations. And Pete Carroll's staff would say, thank you, great, and they would use that information. Well, according to DK Metcalf, he said him and Lockett did that for about 3 or 4 weeks last year in Seattle, and Seattle each time was like, yeah, thanks, and didn't do a damn thing about it, and they were basically running routes into coverages that they could have easily solved if they were doing it the old way. And at that point, they just kind of said, whatever, what are we going to do? We did as, yeah,
right.
Collect your paycheck, and that was it. So, could Metcalf be someone who's knowing that? I would think he's fairly receptive to having a guy like Aaron Rodgers say, when this happens, do this. When this happens, do that. I think he would feel like, thank God, that's what we were trying to do in Seattle, for years, and even have a little more of it because of the fact that Rodgers is probably a more detail-oriented guy pre-snap than what Russ even is. And I would have to think that Calvin Austin, being a young guy, would be and had his best season with an actual starting quarterback with Russell Wilson, that he's going to feel like he's getting an upgrade this year. So we'll see.
And we saw what Rodgers did with Jordy Nelson, and I know that maybe there's a little bit of melanin lacking in that comparison for most people to draw the comparison, but I could see Metcalf doing a lot of those Jordy Nelson things, because Nelson was freakishly athletic and he was very big. And they moved him to places where the big receiver wasn't traditionally used to running, and they were exploiting a lot of stuff. And I think Rodgers could, again, you never know how things are going to mesh conceptually, and if you're going to get the buy-in and everything. Although in Pittsburgh, you tend to have a high rate of getting the buy-in, but there's history there of Rodgers and a large, fast, athletic receiver doing really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And while I would get into the nitty gritty and say that Metcalf wasn't as good of a contested player as Jordy, he's good enough. He is more than good enough.
Jordy Nelson was 90% of Brandon Lloyd 100% of the time, as opposed to Brandon Lloyd, who was only 100% of Brandon Lloyd 50% of the time.
Yeah, very true.
Where God. Jordy Nelson, he didn't quite have the peaks that Lloyd had, but he was getting you something that was Lloyd-esque on the boundary, time after time after time. He was one of the most fun boundary receivers and big slot receivers.
Yeah, I think if you put and I also would say if you put Jordy Nelson and and Des Bryant covered from head to toe in something that you couldn't see their skin or their face, and have them run routes and play again and play a game against opponents, I think you'd confuse the two, and you'd actually think that Jordy Nelson wasn't a very good receiver compared to the other guy, and then you'd unmask them and realize that you just said that about Des Bryant, as opposed to, and that the guy that you thought was Des Bryant was Jordy Nelson.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if you remember, Jordy was on my team to defend the planet like 12 years ago. Just because it was kind of like right at the start of that whole big slot phenomenon that like a couple years later Gronkowski was going to be stepping into. And the NFL has like, like it hasn't like neutralized it or anything, but it's not caught off guard. But like for those 3 to 5 years, if you had a big guy who could run in the middle of the field, it was just a huge offensive advantage.
Yeah. Well, look, this was fun, and we're going to hopefully give you a huge advantage throughout the year as you start to learn more, get into your dynasty leagues. We'll talk more about different subjects as they come up. It's been nice to get back into the groove with you before the season begins. You can find Adam Harstad on Twitter, on X. You can find me there as well. You can find his fantastic work at Football Guys. If you're not reading Adam, I strongly suggest that you do so. And you can click off this podcast right now and get started. I think that would be a good next step for you. Screw work. Just click on, go search Adam on Football Guys, and find some of his work there as the season gets going, and even past work, a lot of evergreen stuff. So thanks again, folks, and we will see you next week.